The great age of exploration began in Europe over 500 years ago, and it brought about changes in the world that are still with us today. Most of the really big changes began to happen when European governments started setting up colonies on the new lands they had discovered, because whenever new colonies were founded, European settlers looking for land or gold soon followed. The European settlers took the best property for themselves, and the native people, whose ancestors had been living on these lands for thousands of years, had to leave, and sometimes died or were forced into slavery. In this program, we will find out what happened between the years 1519 and 1521, when a small group of Spanish soldiers called the Conquistadors, which means the conquerors, destroyed the mighty Aztec Empire of Mexico and turned it into a colony of Spain. For countless centuries, long before the time of Christopher Columbus, the continents of North and South America had been home to hundreds of different tribes of native people. Many of them led simple lives and lived in teepees like this one, or in houses like this one made of bark and sticks, while other tribes built stone cities hidden in the cliffs. But of all the native tribes in the New World, none of them could match the people of Mexico when it came to the civilizations they had developed, because long before the Spanish conquered them, the people of Mexico had been building large cities like this one in many parts of their land. And 500 years ago, in the central part of Mexico, on an island in a huge lake that was ringed by volcanic mountains, there once stood a city more fantastic than any other in the New World, a city called Tenochtitlan, the capital of the powerful Aztec Empire. In 1502, before the Spanish arrived in Mexico, the capital of the Aztec Empire had a population of 100,000 people, making it bigger than any city in Spain. Tenochtitlan was a colorful place of huge stone buildings that were decorated with beautiful carvings. It was where the Aztec Emperor Montezuma II lived, a city of canals and wide streets, where dancers danced, musicians played, and where people came to shop in an open-air marketplace where you could buy almost anything. And in it, just like in the much smaller marketplaces found in Central America today, you could find people selling cloth which they wove by hand, or birds that were prized for their beautiful feathers. In the Aztec markets, you could always buy lots of delicious fruit, as well as many kinds of freshly picked vegetables. But of all the crops raised by the Aztec, the most important was corn, because it could be ground into flour to make tortillas, one of their favorite foods. Even though the Aztec did not have plows to till the soil, corn and other crops were planted in fertile fields outside the city, fields that were crisscrossed with canals that brought water for irrigation. A long time ago, to get from one place to another, the Aztec would paddle down these canals in boats they carved from logs. Today, nearly all of the old Aztec canals are gone, but in the famous floating gardens of Xochimilco, a few of the old canals still remain. Amazingly, they have become a place where modern-day Mexican families come to enjoy a pleasant afternoon, to relax, listen to music, and eat food while they float down waterways that were created by their ancestors hundreds of years ago. Today, most people in Mexico are Christians, a religion that was first brought to the New World by Spanish missionaries. But before the missionaries came to Mexico, the Aztec had their own religion. They worshipped many different gods, and the biggest buildings in their towns were temples to the gods. It was high on the steps of these temples that Aztec priests made human sacrifices to the gods in the hope that, by pleasing them, they would bring rains and a good harvest. In 1502, the Aztec were the most powerful tribe in North America, and the emperor ruled over 5 million people, yet he had never heard of Spain. But it was from here, in the country of Spain, that men were born who would come to conquer the great Aztec Empire. Spain is located in southwestern Europe. It is a mountainous land, dotted with orchards and small villages, and Roman Catholicism is by far its main religion. 500 years ago, Spain was governed by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, the same rulers who, in 1492, gave Christopher Columbus the ships he used to cross the Atlantic Ocean. After Columbus's first voyage to the New World, the Spanish had established colonies on several of the Caribbean islands, including the biggest island, Cuba. It was in Cuba that the governor appointed a man to lead an expedition to Mexico to claim land, to develop trade, and to try to find gold. That man was Hernando Cortés, and he quickly developed his own ideas about this expedition, ideas of conquering and of becoming very rich. In February of 1519, after sailing across the water from Cuba to Mexico, the Spanish ships landed and immediately started to unload their cargo. To the people of Mexico, the Spaniards were both a wonderful and yet a terrifying sight, because never before had they seen big sailing ships, light-skinned men, suits of metal armor, crossbows, guns, cannons, or even horses. The reason they had never seen such things was that they did not exist in either North or South America, and it would turn out that it was these very things that would help bring about the Spanish conquest of Mexico. The people living along the east coast of Mexico told Cortés about the cities of the Aztec that lay to the west, and of the beautiful things of gold they made. And because he loved gold, Cortés decided to go there. He was able to convince thousands of men from other tribes to join him, tribes who hated the Aztec because of the high taxes they had to pay, and because the Aztec often turned them into their slaves. After the Spanish forces and the Mexican warriors left the coast, it took several weeks before they reached Tenochtitlan. Strangely enough, the Aztec emperor welcomed Cortés to the capital and showered him with gifts, thinking he must be their god, Quetzalcoatl. But the emperor soon learned that Cortés was anything but a god, because he had Montezuma arrested, while the conquistadors, with their superior weapons, went about taking Aztec gold and destroying their temples. The Catholic missionaries, who were part of the expedition, also went to work converting the Aztec people to Christianity. But soon the Aztec revolted against the Spanish, forcing Cortés to retreat from the capital. But in 1521, Cortés returned with more soldiers, and by then the Aztec were very weak. They were starving and dying from the diseases they had caught from the Europeans. So it did not take long before they surrendered to the Spanish. This time Cortés and his conquistadors completely destroyed Tenochtitlan, and then began to rebuild it in the style of the great cities of Spain, renaming it Mexico City. In fact, a huge church, the National Cathedral of Mexico, seen here, was built where an Aztec temple once stood. After the conquest, many of the remaining Aztec people were turned into slaves, and for nearly the next 300 years, the Aztec lands of Mexico became a Spanish colony and were ruled by the King of Spain. 10 years later, in 1531, in South America, another Spanish conqueror named Francisco Pizarro led 20 conquistadors who overthrew the great empire of the Incas in Peru, bringing Spanish rule to that land as well. If we look at some maps, we can see just how much land Spain once ruled in the New World. For a while, the Spanish colonial empire that was begun by the conquistadors stretched far to the north into lands that today are part of the United States. And in South America, except for Brazil and a few other very small countries, the Spanish colonies reached all the way to the tip of the continent. Now all the old Spanish colonies are independent countries, but the reminders of Spain are never very far away, because the Spanish language is still spoken, and the customs and religious beliefs of Spain are still followed in all of these countries, from Mexico to as far south as Chile. True or false? The Aztec farmers had no knowledge of irrigation. True or false? The Aztec people had never seen horses until Cortés arrived in Mexico. True or false? The Aztec people thought that by sacrificing human lives, they would have better crops. True or false? In 1502, the Aztec capital city was slightly smaller than the biggest city in Spain. True or false? Aztec guns and cannons were better than those of the Spanish.